All through the bright, breezy afternoon of October 24th, Admiral Halsey and his staff sat in the gloom of Flag Plot, listening. From speakers on the wall, they could hear, through the crackling static, the voices of exultant young pilots masking fear with bravado. The pilots told of torpedo after torpedo hitting Yamato-class battleships, though how many torpedoes and how many battleships remained unclear. They reported frequent near misses and direct hits on Congo-class battleships, though again, with so many different pilots and strike groups, it was hard to keep them all straight. One pilot described a light cruiser capsizing, although in fact none did. Then, at 4:40 p.m., a pilot reported that the Japanese battle force, which had been circling and milling to elude American air attacks, had regrouped. The ships had turned 180 degrees. The Japanese fleet was heading west, away from San Bernardino Strait and its passage to Leyte Gulf. A cry went up in Flag Plot. "We've stopped 'em!" The Japanese fleet appeared to be retreating under the onslaught of more than 270 American planes in 5 successive attacks over 6 hours. There were smiles of relief among the Department of Dirty Tricks. Still, they wondered, as Commander Moulton had been demanding all day long, where were the carriers? Within a few minutes, the answer came. A search plane from Admiral Sherman's carrier group, the furthest north, had spotted a force of Japanese ships. It wasn't clear what types, steaming south. Then one of Sherman's pilots got a good look, and there they were, like so many figments of Halsey's imagination, Japanese carriers heading right for them, less than 200 miles away. The scout plane counted 3 carriers, apparently heavy fleet carriers, 4 to 6 heavy cruisers, and 6 destroyers. Halsey had been yearning to battle Japan's carriers since the morning of December 7, 1941, if not long before. His enthusiasm was tempered by the dilemma of confronting not 1 but 3 enemy fleets. He called for a meeting of the Department of Dirty Tricks. On the broad chart table, where the Japanese ships were tracked with blue pencils and marked with pins and symbols, a pattern was emerging. The main Japanese battleship fleet had been advancing, at least until very recently, on the San Bernardino Strait. A smaller Japanese force was heading toward the Surigao Strait to the south, and the Japanese carriers were coming down from the north. Steaming at a slow pace, about 15 knots, they had all seemed to be converging on the American invasion force at Leyte Gulf. Halsey's men quickly named the pieces of the 3-pronged attack. The larger battleship fleet that had been aiming for San Bernardino Strait was tagged Center Force. The smaller battleship fleet steaming toward Surigao Strait was called Southern Force, and the carriers heading toward them through the Philippine Sea were labeled Northern Force. The Japanese were advancing from the north, south, and west. Halsey's 3 carrier groups were arrayed to the east. It was time for Halsey to decide where to send his ships. He had on hand a huge and powerful fleet, 12 carriers and 6 battleships. Should he keep them concentrated, or divide them, and where should he direct them? One option was to use the entire Third Fleet to guard the San Bernardino Strait, in case Kurita's center force turned around again and came through in the dark. Commander Rollo Wilson, Halsey's operations officer, strenuously argued against that course of action. It would be like sitting and watching a rat hole, waiting for the rats to come out, he said. The lesson of the last battle hung over the teeming, smoky room. Everyone at the table was conscious of the way Admiral Spruance had played it safe 6 months earlier at the Battle of the Philippine Sea, sitting close to the invasion beaches at Saipan rather than venturing forth to take on the Japanese carrier fleet. This was no time for the Spruance nuance, as the Department of Dirty Tricks mockingly described Spruance's caution. Nimitz's instructions had been clear, and clearly reflected regret over Spruance's missed opportunity back in June. If Halsey had the chance to destroy the major portion of the Japanese fleet, meaning the carriers, he should grab it. The second option was to divide the fleet. Halsey could form the battle line, Task Force 34, and send it to guard the San Bernardino Strait, while his main carrier force steamed north to confront the Japanese carriers. This seemed, at first, the prudent choice, but dissenting voices rose. The Chief of Staff, Mick Carney, invoked a cardinal rule of sea battle: never divide your forces, keep power concentrated. Halsey did not need reminding. The lesson, articulated by the great naval thinker Alfred Thayer Mahan, had been drummed into him at Annapolis and again at the Naval War College at Newport. A divided force, warned Mahan, can be defeated in detail piece by a smaller force. Dividing the fleet could be dangerous, Halsey agreed. His dozen carriers were 6 short of full strength. He was shy about 400 warplanes out of his full force of over 1,000. The absent aircraft were mostly with Admiral McCain's 5 carriers, detached to Ulithi for resupply and R&R on October 22nd. That morning, Halsey had ordered McCain to return, but McCain and his planes were not expected back until the next day. The battle line guarding San Bernardino Strait would need air cover, Halsey knew. That would mean leaving a couple of carriers behind. Suddenly, Halsey's strength did not seem so overwhelming. Halsey was left wrestling with some tricky math. 2 light carriers could put aloft 50 fighters. Was that really enough air cover for the battleships? On the other hand, if he detached a whole carrier group, he would seriously deplete his firepower against the Japanese carrier force to the north. Halsey knew that his forces had shot down hundreds of Japanese airplanes, but he did not know how few planes the Japanese had left. He was worried about shuttle bombing, carrier planes bombing the American ships, flying to land bases to refuel and rearm, then flying back and hitting the Americans on the return trip. He was also concerned that other carrier groups might be lurking behind the 3 carriers the scout plane had spotted. Halsey had received top-secret intelligence documents reporting that the Japanese had as many as 6 fleet and 5 light carriers, and he knew that the Japanese often ran intricate, hydra-headed operations. The sinking of the Princeton that day had been a warning that Japanese air power could still bite. The so-called American way of war was to overwhelm the enemy with superior firepower. With big factories and technical know-how, Americans could expend money and metal instead of lives to achieve victory. The Big Blue Fleet was, in some ways, a magnificent exercise in overkill. Halsey didn't want a fair fight against the Japanese. He wanted all the odds on his side. The chance to wipe out the Japanese carriers in a devastating stroke argued for the third option, taking the entire Third Fleet to the north to engage the Japanese carriers. Halsey also may have harboured a personal motivation. Task Force 34, the battle line, included Halsey's flagship, the New Jersey. If the battle line were left guarding the Strait, and if Kurita's fleet was already truly beaten, Halsey would be left to float idly about, watching, as Rollo Wilson had put it, a rat hole. Meanwhile, 150 miles to the north, his fleet might be fighting what promised to be one of the climactic naval battles of history, without him. He never mentioned his private ambitions during the discussions in Flag Plot that evening, but he did not need to. His staff understood that Halsey, having missed the Battle of Midway, was not about to sideline himself from the contest of his life. Admiral Toyoda may have preferred to follow the progress of the decisive battle from Tokyo, but Admiral Halsey wanted to be in on the kill. Among Halsey's staffers, there was also consensus that Admiral Kinkaid and the 7th Fleet could handle both the centre force, if it did rally and come through the San Bernardino Strait, and the southern force, recently spotted on course to enter the Surigao Strait by midnight. Even if the Japanese battleships now retreating in the Sibuyan Sea turned around and came through San Bernardino Strait, they could not reach Leyte Gulf until about 1100 hours, at 11 o'clock the next morning. Halsey's staff had read the messages sent by Admiral Kinkaid, ordering his line commander, Admiral Oldendorf, to form a welcoming committee for the Japanese entering Surigao Strait that night. Halsey's staff reasoned that Oldendorf's 6 battleships and numerous cruisers and destroyers would have plenty of time to knock off the southern force, 2 aging Japanese battleships and a cruiser, before heading north to block the centre force as it descended on Leyte Gulf. "The Japanese will never make it to Leyte Gulf," confidently predicted Commander Moulton. There was a certain casualness to these assumptions, especially considering that Halsey had made no effort to keep Kinkaid in the loop. Halsey's staff took little, if any, notice of some uncomfortable facts about Admiral Oldendorf's old, slow battleships. They had been armed with munitions for bombarding beaches, not shelling enemy ships. About 3/4 of the shells in the magazines of the 7th Fleet were high explosive, packing shrapnel that could cut a swath through soldiers on a battlefield, but only about 1/4 were armour-piercing, necessary to punch through the steel of a battleship. In the confined waters of Leyte Gulf, Oldendorf might hope to trap Kurita's battleships. But if the Japanese broke out, The old battleships of the 7th Fleet were not well suited to fight a running sea battle. In later years, one of Halsey's staff officers vaguely remembered that, a day or two before the battle, the 7th Fleet had asked for armour-piercing rounds from the 3rd Fleet, and that Halsey had made an ammunition ship available. But the recollection was probably faulty. No record of such a request or delivery was ever found. In any case, it was presumptuous and unwise for Halsey's staff to be making assumptions about Admiral Kincaid's intentions and capabilities. No one, it appears, suggested to Admiral Halsey that he simply communicate and ask Kincaid what he planned to do. In the end, the Dirty Tricks Department was deceived by its own eagerness. The excited chatter of the pilots piped over the loudspeaker in Flag Plot, and the flash reports from the combat information centres in the 3 carrier groups had convinced Halsey's men that the centre force was essentially finished. Assistant Air Officer Jack Horner argued that the airstrikes had dropped so many bombs on the topsides of the Japanese ships that their fire control systems had been wrecked, meaning that the Japanese could no longer accurately aim their guns. Horner had no evidence, and his guess was incorrect, but in the heady atmosphere of Flag Plot, Horner's assessment was just another untested assumption accepted as fact. At 6:30 p.m., just after sunset, Lieutenant Commander John Lawrence, the Air Combat Intelligence Officer, recorded a flash report from Admiral Ralph Davison's carrier group. It toted up an impressive list of Japanese ships sinking or out of action. A Yamato-class battleship bombed and torpedoed, left afire and down at the bow. A Congo-class battleship left smoking and badly damaged. Another battleship bombed and torpedoed 2 or 3 times, and a light cruiser torpedoed and seen to roll over. Lawrence wrote in his report distributed through the fleet and to Commander-in-Chief, enemy force on easterly course when first sighted and when last seen on westerly course. Mauled by air attacks, the centre force seemed to be retreating. Some 60 years later, Lawrence, a gracious elderly gentleman sitting erect in his imposing house on Boston's North Shore, recalled the moment. There was a sense of elation, he said. I shared it. Lawrence paused and slowly raised his hand to his face. As Kurita's fleet swung back to the west in the slanting light of late afternoon, the Yamato passed her crippled sister ship, Musashi. She was listing to port and barely moving. Her miserable position was a sorrowful sight, Admiral Ugaki recorded. The foredeck was nearly awash, and water lapped at the imperial crest at the bow. Desperate to do something, Ugaki had radioed her commander, Admiral Inoguchi, instructing him to try to beach the great ship on a shoal where she might be repaired and salvaged. But, her steering damaged, she was doomed to turn slowly in circles. At the moment, I couldn't even think of words to cheer them up, wrote Ugaki. On the wing of the bridge, where he was scanning the surface looking for submarine periscopes, Petty Officer Koitabashi felt a strange anxiety watching one of Japan's 2 great battleships founder. He wondered if his own ship was next. I wasn't losing my fighting spirit, but I asked myself, does this mean that the Yamato is not perfect? He recalled. Silence had fallen over the bridge. We couldn't talk, said Koitabashi. Jiro Iwasa, the young reconnaissance pilot who had been shocked by the sight of a crewman eating a bloody rice ball, grew restless lying in his bunk, nursing his slightly wounded thigh. He wandered up onto the bridge. Before he was turned back and warned not to come too close to the senior officers, he saw Ugaki staring at the Musashi, looking grave and, through his grim features, a little sad. Across the bridge, Admiral Kurita, his jaw thrust out, was staring straight ahead. Iwasa noticed, as he quietly watched from the rear of the bridge, that Ugaki and Kurita, though separated by no more than 30 or 40 feet, seemed remote from each other, not speaking or exchanging glances. Years later, recalling the battle, Kurita told a young naval cadet that his heart ached to leave the Musashi to her fate. Telling himself, "This is war, this is war," he began mustering the will to turn back and face the enemy. 1,000 considerations, from the profound to the practical, weighed upon him. His destroyers had just enough fuel to make it all the way to Leyte Gulf and back again. He did not want them to end up as target practice for the Americans, helpless because their tanks were dry. If he was going to complete his mission to Leyte Gulf, he had to turn around and venture back to the east now, towards San Bernardino Strait. The time was 5:15 in the afternoon. "All right," Kurita announced, shedding his characteristic reticence. Let's go back. His chief of staff, Admiral Koyanagi, seemed taken aback. Are we turning? He asked. Another staff officer spluttered that they had received no answer to their pleas for air support. That's all right. Let's go, Kurita responded. There was barely concealed disgruntlement among Kurita's staff officers. Earlier that afternoon, Combined Fleet Headquarters in Tokyo had sent another message. Probability is great that enemy will employ submarines in the approaches to San Bernardino Strait. Be alert. The message might have been humorous, wrote Japanese journalist Masanori Ito, who interviewed Kurita's staff officers after the battle. Instead, it was ludicrous and infuriating. The anger turned to derision shortly after 6 p.m., when the following message came from Admiral Toyoda, the Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet, by wireless, to be decoded and handed to Admiral Kurita. Trusting in divine guidance, resume the attack. Interrogated after the war, Toyoda explained that Admiral Kurita was to continue on the attack into Leyte Gulf, even if it meant the loss of every ship in the fleet. Kurita's staff officers understood perfectly well that they had been ordered to their deaths. There were jeers in the operations room behind the bridge. Leave the fighting to us. Not even a god can direct naval battles from the shore, protested one officer, while another mockingly rephrased the order. Believing in annihilation, resume the attack. If Kurita heard these rumblings from his monkey seat in the forward corner of the bridge, he said nothing. Once more headed eastward, Kurita's ships filed past the stricken Musashi one last time. She was in her death throes. High in the pagoda superstructure, Admiral Inoguchi was writing a letter of apology to the Emperor. It had been a mistake, he wrote, to believe in the gunpowder of great battleships. Inoguchi's executive officer wanted to stay and die with his commander, but Inoguchi ordered him off the ship so that he could live to seek revenge. As the ship began to settle for its final plunge, Inoguchi gave the order to abandon ship. A sailor named Kiyoshi Watanabe was scrambling up from his duty station below decks when he heard a shout, "The Emperor's portrait! Move aside!" Two petty officers carrying the portrait, draped in a white sheet, pushed him out of the way. Watanabe was bitter. He hated the petty officers for regularly beating him, and he had no more reverence left. He angrily thought to himself that he might die because he had to get out of the way for a picture. With a rattling, roaring groan, the Leviathan dipped and began to roll over. In the fading light, sailors on a nearby destroyer watched, transfixed, as hundreds of desperate men ran and slipped and slid across the Musashi's slowly rotating hull like mice on a treadmill. The stern of the great ship rose straight up out of the dark sea and plunged down, hissing, taking more than 1,000 men with her. Another 1,000 swam for their lives, trying not to be sucked down by an enormous whirlpool that forced even the attending destroyer to steer clear. Voices could be heard across the water, crying for help, but also singing marching songs and the national anthem, and finally, as dusk turned to night, a popular tune, Shanghai Girl. That evening, as he wrote in his diary by the light of the red battle lamp, Admiral Ugaki grieved for the Musashi, which, he felt, had sacrificed herself for Yamato. He was as fatalistic as ever. I therefore finally made up my mind to share the fate of the ship without reservation, having decided to have Yamato as my death place. He recorded the telegram from the Combined Fleet to keep on advancing, convinced of heavenly guidance. He also noted a scrap of intelligence about what awaited them, not much or very precise information, but enough to at once disappoint him and arouse his fevered hopes. The American invasion fleet at Leyte had mostly gone out, he wrote, leaving a few big ships in the bay, slim pickings after such an arduous journey. But there was an enemy task force floating somewhere out there on the other side of the San Bernardino Strait. Perhaps the enemy would close and engage in a decisive battle. It was my idea at the time that once we got out of the channel, we should search for an area where an enemy would most likely be found and attack it. He was being wishful, he knew, hoping his battleships could get close enough to the American carriers, whose planes could outrage his guns. Reality intruded as he recalled the incessant bombing of the past day in the Sibuyan Sea. Without air cover, Ugaki wrote bitterly, all of our fighting strength will be reduced to nothing at the end. Yasukuni Shrine beckoned from beyond. Ugaki pledged himself to be reborn 7 times to serve the country. In the gathering darkness, a lone American night search plane flew high above Kurita's battered fleet. The pilot radioed his carrier, the Independence, that the Japanese battle fleet had turned around once again, and now was headed on a southeasterly course, headed toward the San Bernardino Strait. The message reached Flag Plot aboard the New Jersey at about 8 p.m. Admiral Halsey was just going to bed. A few minutes earlier, he had made a great show of striding into the crowded room, leaning over the chart, and stabbing with his finger at a point in the Philippine Sea where the Japanese carriers had been sighted late that afternoon. "Here's where I'm going," he announced. "Mick," he said, turning to his chief of staff, Mick Carney, "start him north." Carney immediately began writing up orders, sending all 3 carrier groups to a rendezvous point for the northward charge. By the time the messages were transmitted at 8:20 p.m., Halsey had already retired to his cabin 1 deck below Flag Plot, not to be disturbed. He had been awake for almost all of the past 48 hours. He desperately needed a few hours of rest if he was to rise in the middle of the night and command what he expected to be the defining sea battle of the war. It is not clear from contemporaneous records whether Halsey was told, before he retired, that the center force had turned back toward the Strait. Some time after the battle, Halsey, who, to his dying day, never conceded that he had erred by taking his entire fleet north, told his old battle line commander, Adam Willis Ching Lee, privately that he was sorry he had not been awakened with the report that Kurita's remaining force was remounting its attack. Halsey's remark suggests that he went to bed unawares, and that he felt at least a hidden twinge of regret that he had not had the chance to rethink his strategy. If Halsey had been warned as early as 8 p.m. that Kurita was coming through, might he have left the battle line to guard the San Bernardino Strait? Possibly, though it seems more likely that he would have kept on steaming after the carriers, assuming all the while that Kincaid was defending Leyte Gulf. Halsey had made his name by bold actions, not by hedging. He had come to believe the newspaper headlines about Bull Halsey, and he had for years nurtured his Ahab-like pursuit of Japanese carriers. "We were obsessed with the carriers," said Lawrence, using the same word Mick Carney employed to describe Halsey's fixation. Halsey's staff felt free to argue with Halsey, but only up to the moment when Halsey made a decision. Then, in the rigid tradition of naval command at sea, argument ceased. Changed circumstances, Kurita's reversal, of course, should have been enough to reopen the debate, but Halsey's staff by then had saluted and determined to carry out his order. Halsey did not have the opportunity to reconsider his decision until much later, until he arose after midnight, by which time his fleet was well along on its course toward the enemy carriers. Halsey's staff deferred not just from obedience, but out of concern for his physical and emotional health. They were worried about the man they affectionately called Admiral Bill. Many years later, John Lawrence recalled the enormous tension in Flag Plot as information about Japanese fleet movements came pouring in from disparate and sometimes conflicting sources. "It was unbelievable everyone was wound so tight," said Lawrence. The staff remembered that Halsey had succumbed to stress once before, in April 1942, when he had come down with the psychosomatic skin rash after the frantic hit-and-run raids in the Pacific and on Tokyo. "I'm perfectly sure that the disease was the result of the Doolittle raid," Lawrence recalled. Everyone had this on their mind. Throughout combat operations that September and October, Halsey's doctor, Carnes Piggy Weeks, tried to put Halsey at ease with ribald jokes and a nightly shot or two of whiskey. After the war, Weeks told his son Carnes Weeks Jr. that he routinely used alcohol to help Halsey sleep. In those days, sleeping pills were powerfully narcotic, knocking a person out for 8 hours. Weeks used whiskey as a lighter drug to induce relaxation and drowsiness. "He told me that he tried to make Halsey comfortable, as he put it," said Carnes Weeks Jr. Dr. Weeks may have used alcohol as a mild sedative, and then, in effect, collaborated with Mick Carney and the rest of the staff to hang a "Do Not Disturb" sign outside Halsey's cabin. "I have no doubt that Piggy Weeks gave Halsey something to drink that night," said Lawrence. Dr. Weeks also knew that Halsey, like many of his staff, was under the weather. On October 26, 1944, less than 2 days later, Weeks wrote his wife, Margaret, that Adam, Bill, Mick, Harold and others have all been laid low with the flu. pretty sick, but all now recovering, pretty ticklish as this was right when things were hot. Mick was Carney, Harold was Harold Dow, the communications officer, and their illness may help explain why Halsey's staff work was inadequate at this critical moment. On this of all nights, Halsey's communications were sloppily worded and imprecise. One wonders if Ham Dow was so feverish that he simply overlooked crucial details, making sure Kincaid was kept informed. Harold was quite ill, just beginning to get around, Weeks wrote his wife on October 26th. Dow was not bedridden. Others remember seeing him in Flagplot that night. No one could afford to be incapacitated when things were hot, and it was unmanly to admit to feeling poorly to anyone but the Admiral's doctor. But Weeks knew who was sick and who was well, and he understandably wanted to give Admiral Bill as much chance to rest as possible. Not everyone on Halsey's staff agreed that the Admiral had made the right decision by heading north en masse. Mike Cheek, the chief intelligence officer, had never fit in with the boisterous, dirty tricksters. During the discussion of the possible options around dusk on October 24th, Cheek had stood in the back of Flagplot and said nothing. When Halsey's staff went down to the Admiral's mess to continue the discussion over dinner, Cheek went to his stateroom to rest before coming back on watch. Still, he tried to do something. In Flagplot, after Halsey had given the order to head north and then retired, a furious argument broke out between Cheek and Doug Moulton, the air operations officer. With some bitterness, Cheek regarded the sometimes pompous Moulton as Halsey's favourite. Cheek had just seen the report from the Independent's night search plane that Kurita's central force had reversed course and was headed for the San Bernardino Strait. Armed with this information, worried that Halsey was leaving the Strait unguarded, Cheek accosted Moulton. Normally, Cheek wrote crabbed little notes to the Chief of Staff while Moulton expostulated, but this time Cheek stood his ground. "They're coming through, I know," said Cheek. "I've played poker with them." But Moulton was unpersuaded. He brushed off Cheek's arguments by saying that orders had already gone out. Besides, he told Cheek, the central force was finished. It can't do any damage. Cheek was not the only doubter in Flagplot that night. Lieutenant Harris Cox, Cheek's deputy intelligence officer, was deeply bothered by Halsey's decision to head him north. Cox was just a junior officer, and he said nothing as he manned his duty station, a stand-up desk piled with intelligence documents, in the corner of Flagplot. After he came off watch at 8 p.m., he returned to his small cabin and told his roommate, Lieutenant Solberg, that he was appalled. Halsey, he told Solberg, had just done what the Japanese hoped he would. Cox was preoccupied with a captured Japanese document. It was titled Z Operation Orders, Secret Combined Fleet Orders Operation Number 73. These were the secret orders lost by Admiral Fukudome, the Combined Fleet Chief of Staff, when he was shot down in March of 1944. The 28-page document was a series of contingency plans for thwarting American invasions of Japan's defensive perimeter. The plan clearly stated that the primary objective of the Japanese surface forces was to sink the American troop transports at the invasion beach. The Japanese carriers were supposed to hover over the horizon and make a flank attack. Admiral Spruance had been influenced by the captured Z orders during the Battle of the Philippine Sea. He had stuck close to the beach lest Japanese battleships slip behind and attack the invasion force while the Third Fleet was off chasing carriers. Apparently determined to do the opposite of whatever Spruance did, Admiral Halsey's staff had not seemed to pay much heed to the Z orders, except to note that they recommended the tactic of shuttle bombing, sending planes between carriers and land bases. Cox was frustrated by his superior's indifference to such an important blueprint. "He kept the document in our quarters and was forever pulling it out of a drawer and talking with me about it," recalled Solberg. "He also went over it with Captain Cheek, our chief." But while Halsey and his top men had endlessly debated and tried to guess Japan's next move, the reticent, tongue-tied Cheek had been unable to get the attention of Halsey or the rest of the Department of Dirty Tricks. As the New Jersey vibrated from her giant turbines, barely rolling as she slashed northward through the calm Philippine Sea, the two young intelligence officers wondered what to do. Finally, Cox decided to go to Captain Cheek one last time, to persuade him to go up the chain of command and warn that the Japanese were luring the Americans in the wrong direction. Cox and Solberg were unaware of Cheek's earlier run-in with Commander Moulton. Neither man had been in Flag Plot at the time. They had heard about it later from an assistant operations officer who had witnessed the furious argument. Now, shortly before 10 p.m., Cox and Solberg found the gaunt, worn-looking Cheek in his cabin. Cheek listened wearily. He had seen that the Japanese seemed to be gathering to hit the transports at Leyte Gulf, he told Cox and Solberg. But, he said, he had not necessarily concluded that the Japanese carriers were decoys, being used to lure away the Third Fleet. Still, he had not been sitting idly. He had tried to persuade Commander Moulton that the centre force was not finished, merely retreating as a bluff. Moulton had rebuffed him, said Cheek. Cox and Solberg urged their boss to try harder, to go up a notch on the chain of command and appeal to Mick Kearney. If Cheek could just persuade Kearney, then the Chief of Staff could awaken Admiral Halsey before it was too late to avoid falling into a trap. Mike Cheek was not as timid as he seemed. He had barely escaped the Japanese onslaught on Manila at the beginning of the war, and he had been through typhoons at sea, once aboard a destroyer that rolled almost 90 degrees. While inarticulate, Cheek was smart, and he, unlike his colleagues in Halsey's wardroom, had some understanding of the Japanese. This was the moment to use his insight, to play the role of intelligence officer and provide the information that his commander needed to correct his judgment. Cheek disappeared into the suite of rooms shared by Kearney and Halsey, just off the mess room below Flag Plot. A few minutes later, according to Solberg's account, Cheek returned to report disappointing news. He said he had made their case to Admiral Kearney, but that Kearney had replied that Halsey was asleep, not to be disturbed. More than 2 decades later, Cheek gave a slightly different account in a letter to naval historian Clark Reynolds. Kearney had gone to bed, ill and exhausted, but Cheek woke him up. Kearney could not have been too pleased to be roused, but according to Cheek, he said, "Since you feel so strongly, you have my permission to awaken the Admiral, but I do not believe it will do any good. As you know, he has had little or no sleep in the past 48 hours. Kearney made a reference to another staffer whose dissenting views earlier that evening had been overridden by Halsey. Cheek did not have the heart to take on Halsey. I silently agreed that any effort on my part would be useless, Cheek recalled. Cheek was deeply worried that the Third Fleet was being led astray, but he had never felt comfortable directly addressing Halsey, and he could not bring himself to do it now. Cheek's sense of alarm and resignation in the face of Halsey's bullheadedness and guard-dog staff was shared by more powerful men. Indeed, almost all of Halsey's top commanders had misgivings about his course of action, but, out of fatigue or deference, they did not push their objections. Halsey was not a cruel or frightening figure, but he exuded such cockiness and lust for command that he overawed even the most confident men, especially men who had been more or less continuously at sea for months and even years. In a sea-born world of absolute authority, Halsey had become too much the pirate king. No one dared cross him. Aboard the battleship Washington, the commander of the battle line, Admiral Ching Lee, had guessed before the sun went down that the Japanese carriers were decoys, and he sent a signal to the New Jersey expressing his views. From someone on Halsey's staff, he received a perfunctory roger. Again, when Lee saw a report from a snooper night fighter aboard the Independence that the center force had turned east again, he signaled the New Jersey warning that the Japanese were setting a trap. Again, a roger, and nothing more. Lee, a hero at Guadalcanal for sinking a Japanese battleship in a night action, was tired after 2 years of combat operations at sea. He did not press his opinion. The New Jersey was sailing in a carrier group under the command of a gruff Irishman named Jerry Bogan. Flying his flag from the carrier Intrepid, Admiral Bogan was communicating by short-range TBS with Captain E.C. Ewan of the carrier Independence, whose night search planes were keeping a watch on Kurita's fleet. Ewan told Bogan that Kurita's fleet was headed for the San Bernardino Strait. His pilots had reported that for the first time in weeks, navigation lights had been turned on in the narrow, twisting strait, an ominous sign that the Japanese were coming through. Bogan later recalled that he thought Halsey was making one hell of a mistake by leaving the strait unguarded. Bogan drew up a recommendation that Task Force 34, Admiral Lee's battle line, be detached, along with a couple of carriers for air cover, to await Kurita's fleet. Bogan drafted a message to Halsey saying that the navigation lights were shining brightly in the San Bernardino Strait and that Kurita's center force was heading right for it. Taking the TBS phone handle, Bogan personally read the message to one of Halsey's staffers aboard the New Jersey. Yes, we have that information, came the response. Bogan later recalled that the Halsey staffer spoke to him in a rather impatient voice. Bogan felt he was being given the brush-off. He did not bother to try to persuade the commander of the Third Fleet to detach the battle line. He didn't think that Halsey or his staff would listen. Aboard the Lexington, Admiral Mark Mitcher was, in theory at least, the commander of all 4 carrier groups of the Third Fleet. Mitcher had his own ideas about how to handle the Japanese. Before sunset, he had discussed them with his staff. Mitcher wanted to send the battle line racing north to attack the Japanese carriers, then quickly bring them back to catch Kurita's center fleet, either before or after it arrived in Leyte Gulf the next day. Carrier planes could finish off the remnants of Ozawa's northern force at dawn. If everyone moved right away, there was just enough time to, in effect, kill 2 birds with 1 stone. But Mitcher hesitated. He was reluctant to press the plan on Halsey. At about 8:30 p.m., Mitcher received Halsey's command to take all the carrier groups and the battle line north. Admiral Halsey is in command now, Mitcher told his subordinates. From his flat tone of resignation, it was clear he was disheartened. Carrier Commander Mitcher was, in effect, being pushed aside. A fellow officer once joked that Mitcher didn't look a day over 80. Lately he had been sleeping more and more and speaking less and less. Bone-weary, Mitcher went to bed. Meanwhile, Mitcher's chief of staff, Arleigh Burke, stewed impatiently. 31-kilo-knot Burke, the gallant destroyer-man from the Solomons unwillingly drafted to be Mitcher's number 2, had made peace with his boss and immersed himself in carrier operations. He had keen instincts, and they all told him that his former hero Halsey and his staff were about to commit an epic blunder. Burke had closely observed the one-sided air battle off Formosa just 10 days earlier. He could accurately guess that Japanese air power had been badly depleted. Notwithstanding the loss of the Princeton, he thought the Japanese air attacks over the past day had been poorly coordinated and weak. If the Japanese carriers were out there, they didn't present much of a threat. Like Admiral Lee, Burke suspected that the carriers were being used as decoys. At the same time, Burke guessed that the Japanese battleship fleet now making for the San Bernardino Strait was more powerful than Halsey assumed. The air combat intelligence officers on Mitcher's staff were more experienced with carrier operations than Halsey's team. They understood how often and how much pilots exaggerated their claims. Burke discounted the damage report on Kurita's fleet. He predicted that the Japanese would still have plenty of firepower when they emerged from the strait and headed for Leyte Gulf. Burke had explained his views to Admiral Mitcher. "Well, I think you're right, but I don't know you're right," replied the beaten-down Mitcher. "I don't think we ought to bother Admiral Halsey." But Burke continued to fret. As Mitcher slept, Burke studied the reports coming in from the Independence's search planes. At 11:05 p.m., the last dispatch showed the Central Force about to enter the San Bernardino Strait. Burke decided to awaken Mitcher, to get him to implore Halsey to detach the battle line to plug the gaping hole. Burke and his operations officer, Commander James Flatley, knocked on the door of Mitcher's cabin. The Admiral was lying in his bunk. "Admiral," said Flatley, "we better tell Halsey to turn around." Mitcher raised himself on one elbow as Flatley described the report from the search plane tracking Kurita's fleet. "Does Admiral Halsey have that report?" he asked. "Yes, he does," said Flatley. "He wants my advice," said Mitcher. "He will ask for it." Then he rolled over and went back to sleep. About a half-hour before midnight, a dive bomber off the Independence, piloted by Lieutenant Bill Phelps, flew high above the narrow western entrance of the San Bernardino Strait. There, in solemn single-file procession, were more than a dozen Japanese warships, including 4 battleships. Lieutenant Phelps could see the ships playing their searchlights off the high cliffs at the entrance of the strait as the column crept through the narrow waters. It was the last look at Kurita's fleet that Phelps, or any American pilot, would get that night. All search planes were commanded by Halsey's staff to head north, to search for the Japanese carriers. "It was a strange night," recalled lookout Kosaku Koitabashi. From high atop the superstructure of the Yamato, he stood watch, peering through high-power binoculars while trying to ignore pangs of hunger and waves of fatigue. A dim half-moon shone through a milky sky as Kurita's fleet entered the San Bernardino Strait at about 11:20 p.m. The fleet, diminished but still lethal, navigated the treacherous 10-mile channel against an 8-knot tide. Rain squalls swept in, but it didn't seem like the tropics, remembered Koitabashi. It was foggy. There was no visibility. When a dark shape loomed up behind the Yamato, Koitabashi and the other lookouts cried out a warning. The battleship Congo came surging out of the murk, nearly staving in the Yamato's stern. The two behemoths swung apart at the last moment. The squalls passed, and the night cleared as the fleet entered the empty Philippine Sea at 20 minutes past midnight on the morning of October 25th. Koitabashi had been at his battle station for most of 2 days. Going without sleep was a test of spiritual strength, but most of the officers and men just looked grim and exhausted. Koitabashi and his mates had grabbed rice balls from a bucket passed around the bridge, and they had been given occasional cigarette breaks. The gossip at the Bon had turned gloomy. "We expected to be torpedoed in the morning," Koitabashi recalled. The signalmen reported that Tokyo had sent a message ordering the fleet to charge ahead, with divine assistance, but requests for air support had gone unanswered. "We kept saying, 'Where are our airplanes?'" recalled Koitabashi. Admiral Kurita had plunged into the strait without much idea of what he would find on the other side. His request for scout planes had been greeted by silence. He had not heard anything from Admiral Ozawa. With Ozawa's radio transmitter broken, Kurita had no way of knowing that Ozawa was successfully luring the American carriers off to the north. Kurita tried to keep a brave face on. Chancing annihilation, he had radioed headquarters at 10:13 p.m. His fleet was determined to break through to the American anchorage at Leyte Gulf to destroy the enemy. Optimistically, given the circumstances, or possibly just by rote, Kurita's staff drew up a schedule and plan of attack. The Admiral wanted to arrange a rendezvous with the southern arm of the pincer movement, Admiral Nishimura's force, at 9 a.m. near Suluan Light, at the mouth of Leyte Gulf. He need not have sent the order. To any objective observer, the rendezvous was doomed, given the mismatch of ships and firepower between Kinkaid's warships defending Leyte Gulf and Nishimura's last-gasp fleet approaching from the south. As he sailed through the Sulu Sea 200 miles to the south of Kurita's force, Admiral Nishimura was paying no attention to schedules. Shortly after 10 p.m., he wired Kurita that he planned to break through to Leyte Gulf at 4 that morning. But rather than slow down to delay his arrival until Kurita could join forces, he speeded up. Nishimura may have assumed, correctly, that he would not live to see the dawn. His ships were old and slow. Indeed, his 2 battleships were virtually obsolete, relegated for use as training vessels in the inland sea. He had been given as well the most weakly armed cruiser and the oldest destroyers, clearly a fleet assembled as cannon fodder. The combined fleet was holding nothing back. Essentially, anything that could float was being thrown into the attack. Shoji Nishimura was, like so many of his brother officers, a fatalist. He had lost his beloved only son, who had graduated at the top of his class from Etajima, in a seaplane accident in the first weeks of the war. He had no interest in politics. Like Kurita, he avoided shore duty. When Kurita made him the commander of the small southern force for the attack on Leyte Gulf, Nishimura made no attempt to make the acquaintance of the captains of the ships under his command. He had been present, with a smile fixed on his face, when Kurita gave his pep talk on the evening of October 21st, saying, "You must all remember there are such things as miracles." But he had not bothered to attend a final conference of captains and staff at Brunei before the fleet sorted on October 22nd. There was no real point to it, except to exchange farewell toasts. "We were told to look out for a shoal in the northern part of Leyte Gulf," recalled the captain of the destroyer Shigure, who did attend the meeting, and whose ship would be the only one of Nishimura's 7 warships to return. "We determined to do our best. Then we had a few drinks. MacArthur's Navy, the 7th Fleet, was waiting. Admiral Kinkaid's fleet was organized to support invasions by bombarding beaches, not to fight attacking fleets. That was Halsey's job. Even so, the coming battle promised to be more like target practice. The Seventh Fleet packed enough firepower to cripple Nishimura's 2 battleships, 1 cruiser and 4 destroyers, as they tried to break through the narrow mouth of the Surigao Strait. There had been ample time to prepare. After receiving reports that Nishimura was in the Sulu Sea steaming east toward the strait that morning, Admiral Kincaid had issued an order to prepare for night battle. Admiral Oldendorf, the commander of the American ships lining up to greet Nishimura, was an unapologetic practitioner of the American way of war. He believed in massed firepower and overwhelming force, or, as he later explained to the New York Times, "My theory is that of an old-time gambler. Never give a sucker a chance." To that end, Oldendorf arrayed his welcoming committee. First, 39 PT boats would attack. Then 28 destroyers would make torpedo runs or fire their 5-inch guns. Then 4 light cruisers and 4 heavy cruisers would open up with 6-inch and 8-inch guns. Then, steaming in line abreast across the northern neck of the Surigao Strait, 6 battleships armed with 14-inch and 16-inch guns would finish off anything that was left. Salvaged from the wreckage of Pearl Harbor and equipped with modern radar and fire control, the old battle wagons would gain sweet revenge. They would, as the Naval War College textbooks dictated, cross the T. For centuries, the goal in a sea battle was to place a line of battleships broadside to the bows of the enemy, thereby bringing more guns to bear. Admiral Togo had crossed the T of the Russian fleet at Tsushima in 1905. Now, for the last time in history, battleship would face battleship in a classic crossing the T engagement. The sea was glassy as Nishimura's ships approached the Surigao Strait in the deepening night. The moon was due to set after midnight. The sky would become inky black under low clouds and passing squalls. At 10:36 p.m., Ensign Peter Gadd's PT-137 picked up the Japanese on radar, and along with 2 other PT boats, charged at 24 knots. Wooden speedboats were rarely effective against steel warships, but their warning set off a night of fireworks and appalling slaughter. Nishimura made little attempt at evasive action. He ploughed straight ahead into a murderous crossfire of torpedoes and crashing heavy guns. The arched line of tracers in the darkness looked like a continual stream of lighted railroad cars going over a hill, recalled a destroyer captain who watched in awe as the fire poured down on the luckless Japanese. The Japanese tried to fire off star shells to illuminate the enemy, but the bursts of white light just added to the sure reality of the carnage. Tons of shells rained down. More than 100 torpedo wakes crisscrossed the water. Most of the flying metal was American. The only real damage done to an American ship, the destroyer Albert W. Grant, came mostly from other American ships' friendly fire. 2 Japanese destroyers were quickly sunk. The battleship Fuso was cut in half. Admiral Nishimura's battleship, the Yamashiro, burned brightly from stem to stern. The admiral sent a last command to his vanishing fleet. "We have received a torpedo attack. You are to proceed and attack all ships." Then, shortly after 4 a.m., his ship blew apart and capsized. Into this inferno, a second separate Japanese fleet of 2 cruisers and 4 destroyers came steaming, or blundering. In the smoke and darkness, the advancing flagship Nachi collided with one of Nishimura's battered vessels, the cruiser Mogami. "Sorry!" cried the Mogami gunnery officer, who had taken over for the dead captain and dead executive officer. The story of this orphan fleet, under the command of an admiral who had spent most of his career as a courtier and shore-based staff officer, is a pitiful footnote to the combined fleet's Gotterdammerung strategy. Some 10 days earlier, Admiral Kiyohide Shima of the 2nd Diversionary Striking Force had been ordered to mop up the remnants of Halsey's supposedly shattered fleet off Formosa. Instead, Shima's fleet had barely escaped the trap set by the Department of Dirty Tricks. For the next week, Shima's ships wandered about receiving conflicting orders until they were told to join forces with Admiral Nishimura's fleet. The 2 admirals never coordinated their movements. Shima's failure to contact Nishimura may have been partly a matter of face. Shima was senior to Nishimura and did not want to take orders from him. And by now, Shima was fed up with playing the role of sacrificial fleet. "We were feeling disappointed, angry, indignant," he later recalled. When Shima saw the wreckage of Nishimura's ships in the pre-dawn hours of October 25th, he briefly pondered his options. He was shocked by the sight of 2 battleships burning. The fires were terrific, he later recalled. They looked like steel mill flames. He could hear through the smoke the slow crump of big guns. Soon they would be aiming at him. He gave the order, "Attack! All ships attack!" But his staff had a better idea. The enemy was waiting with open arms, they argued. It was foolish to go ahead. Shima was not, like Nishimura, an old sea dog resigned to his fate. He missed those comfortable shore billets. Deciding that his staff's arguments made good sense, he turned around and fled for home. In the grey first light of October 25th, a day of reckoning for the Imperial Japanese Navy, thousands of Japanese sailors floated in the oil-slicked waters of Surigao Strait. Most of the men were not waiting to be rescued. When American boats lowered from destroyers and cruisers tried to pick them up, officers could be heard yelling at their men to swim away, to drown rather than be captured. In a whaleboat from the destroyer Claxton, a machinist's mate rigged a lasso and roped in a Japanese sailor. One sailor did wish to surrender. As he tried to climb aboard an American destroyer, the USS Edwards, he was pulled back by another Japanese swimmer, who unceremoniously slit his craven comrade's throat. Sailors who swam to surrounding islands were greeted by bolo knife, wielding Filipinos with fresh memories of Japanese occupation. In the early morning hours, Admiral Kincaid sent a message of congratulations to Admiral Oldendorf for a job well done. Through the night, Kincaid had listened to reports of the rout from the Wasatch, anchored off Red Beach in Leyte Gulf. Kincaid had been busy attending to myriad details and responsibilities, not the least of which was the care and feeding of his difficult boss, General MacArthur. The commander-in-chief had been quartered aboard the cruiser Nashville. When it appeared that the Nashville would join Oldendorf's battle, MacArthur wanted to go along to see the fight. He told Kincaid that he had read all his life about the glamour of sea battle. It excited his imagination. Kincaid demurred. The Nashville stayed at anchor with Kincaid's flagship. Kincaid had been preoccupied with the battle raging in Surigao Strait. Having intercepted Halsey's battle plan to form Task Force 34 earlier that afternoon, he assumed that Halsey would handle the San Bernardino Strait if Kurita's central force were to break through and descend on Leyte Gulf from the north. Shortly after 8 on the evening of the 24th, Kincaid received a message from Halsey, saying that Kurita's central force was heavily damaged. Halsey continued, "I'm proceeding north with 3 groups to attack enemy carrier force at dawn." Kincaid should have stopped to wonder if Halsey meant by "am proceeding" that Halsey, personally, was headed north. Under Halsey's battle plan, the 3rd Fleet Commander's flagship, the New Jersey, was supposed to be left guarding the San Bernardino Strait with Task Force 34. But Kincaid does not appear to have pondered Halsey's machinations, perhaps because he was busy with his own. In hindsight, Kincaid assumed too much and questioned too little. It is not clear how much warning Halsey gave Kincaid that Kurita was headed for later. Halsey's message, "am proceeding north," gave Kurita's course direction, 120 degrees southeast, indicating that the Japanese were no longer retiring west. Halsey later claimed that at about 11 p.m., the 3rd Fleet passed on to Kincaid the report from the Independence's night snoopers that Kurita's fleet had progressed 20 miles closer to the San Bernardino Strait, though there is no record of such a telegram in 7th Fleet message files. In any case, there can be no doubt that Halsey and Kincaid, because of separate chains of command, because of personal rivalry or enmity, because of fatigue and the friction of war, made only the most cursory attempts to communicate with each other. After a warm reception had been arranged for the Japanese in Surigao Strait, Kincaid asked his staff, as the hour approached 4 a.m., if there was anything they had overlooked. Captain Richard Cruzen, the operations officer, spoke up. "We've never asked Halsey directly if Task Force 34 is guarding the San Bernardino Strait." Kincaid told him to send a cable to Halsey just to make sure. The telegram was sent at 4:12 a.m. Halsey would not receive it for another 2.5 hours, at 6:48 a.m. It may seem shocking that a telegram of such urgency and time sensitivity could take so long to be delivered, but instant communication had fallen victim to divided command and the creaky technology of sending encrypted telegrams. Kincaid's message was sent to Halsey through a radio station 1,500 miles away, where 2-hour delays were typical. The radio station at Manus, a sweatshop of harried operators hunched over telegraphs on a desolate island off the coast of New Guinea, was a notorious bottleneck. Theoretically, messages marked urgent had priority, but before long there were so many messages marked urgent that they began to pile up. Messages could take up to 4 hours to wind their way between Kincaid and Halsey, and often they arrived out of sequence, further adding to the confusion and delay. It was an atrocious form of communication. At crucial moments, the fleets might as well have been signalling each other with flags. Kincaid took a few steps, inadequate and half-hearted in retrospect, to find out if Kurita's fleet was coming through the Strait. Shortly after noon on October 24th, he had ordered a squadron of PBYs, slow amphibious planes, based in Leyte Gulf to look for Kurita's fleet. Bothered by mechanical problems, delayed by a Japanese air raid, the squadron managed to send only one Catalina Black Cat up the coast of Samar over the strait. The plane's journey was harrowing. Its radar could not distinguish between islands and ships. Fired on repeatedly by American ships, the PBY's crew began to give every blip on the radar a wide berth and became lost. The pilot thought he saw the wakes of an enemy fleet, but he could not be sure, and never made a report. Inattention, flawed assumptions, long and twisted or broken chains of command are the norm, not the exception, throughout the history of warfare. So are fatigue, distraction, emotional and physical overload. So too, fear, vainglory, error. But the gods of war needed to be particularly fickle, not to mention heartless, to arrange the collision that was about to occur on the morning of October 25, 1944, the last and most destructive day in the long history of fleets fighting at sea. October 25th was, fittingly, the anniversary day of the Battle of Balaclava in the Crimean War, the epic blunder memorialized in Tennyson's poem The Charge of the Light Brigade. But it was also St. Crispin's Day, the anniversary of the Battle of Agincourt remembered by Shakespeare's Henry V. This day is called the Feast of Crispian. He that outlives this day and comes safe home will stand a tiptoe when this day is named, and rouse him at the name of Crispian October 25, 1944, deserves to be remembered, like the Charge of the Light Brigade, for its errors and foolish waste of life. But it should be remembered, and is remembered by its survivors, for great acts of courage and sacrifice. Halsey's failure to guard the San Bernardino Strait did not give Kurita clear sailing to Leyte Gulf. MacArthur's navy stood in the way, but it was a much weaker force, and its presence in the path of Kurita's fleet was an accident, an oversight. The commanders of these American ships had not been preparing for heroic battle. On this St. Crispin's Day, there was no King Henry to inspire. We few, we happy few, we band of brothers. For he today that sheds his blood with me shall be my brother. There were only ordinary men, waiting around in chow lines for breakfast, wondering what the day would bring, and hoping, for the most part, not much. To support amphibious landings, MacArthur's navy had its own formation of aircraft carriers. The ships were regarded as a bit of a joke, even by the men who manned them. They were called escort carriers or jeep carriers, and sometimes, with greater sarcasm, Kaiser coffins, tomato cans, Woolworth flat tops, and one torpedo ships. U.S. warships bore official designators. A battleship was a BB, a destroyer a DD, a fleet carrier a CV, and so forth. An escort carrier, originally designed to transport planes and escort convoys in the Atlantic, was labelled CVE, which, according to the shipboard wags, stood for combustible, vulnerable, and expendable. Jeep carriers were about half the size of Essex-class fleet carriers, the fast heavies. The escort carriers were slow, with a maximum speed of about 18 knots, and light. They were built, cheaply and quickly, initially on the hulls of merchantmen. Their steel skins were thin and their armaments weak, a single 5-inch gun. To save money, Kaiser Steel neglected to install the hulls with air blowers, so the men sweltered below decks. Jeep carrier sailors had to endure derision as well as discomfort. Jeep carriers, wrote Admiral Samuel Eliot Morrison, were regarded by many an old sailor as interlopers in the Navy, something like reservists, to be tolerated during the war but not taken too seriously. Each carrier had about a dozen fighters and a dozen bombers, armed usually with 100-pound anti-personnel bombs, not ship-killing 500- and 2,000-pound bombs or torpedoes. The planes were meant to strafe beaches, not fight fleet actions at sea. The 7th Fleet's 18 jeep carriers were divided into 3 groups with the radio call signs Taffy 1, Taffy 2, and Taffy 3. Even the candy name Taffy seemed warlike. The Taffy sailors could only envy the fast heavies and battle line of the Big Blue Fleet. All through October 23rd and 24th, as Halsey's carrier task force manoeuvred and sent attack planes in waves against the Japanese, and the 7th Fleet battle line wreaked havoc in the Surigao Strait, the 3 Taffys floated off Leyte Gulf. They were not idle. Their fighters shot down 24 Japanese warplanes flying over Red Beach on October 24, but they were not meant to tangle with any Japanese capital ships. It is clear that Admiral Kinkaid should have moved the Taffys still further from Leyte Gulf during the night of October 24th to 25th to keep them well clear of any sea battle with Kurita's fleet. Yet Kinkaid did not think it was necessary to warn the Taffys, especially Taffy 3, the northernmost carrier group, less than 50 miles off the coast of Samar. When Staff Officer Captain Paulus Powell suggested that the Taffys might be in danger of getting sucked into a fleet action, Kinkaid rather sarcastically replied. Powell recalled, "What would you have me do with them? Bring them in here?" Meaning bring them into the 7th Fleet anchorage inside Leyte Gulf. When the staff officer suggested moving Taffy 3 out to sea another 30 miles, Kinkaid declined. There were snide jokes about the Taffy 3 commander. Captain Powell remarked that Felix Stump of Taffy 2 and Thomas Sprague of Taffy 1 would do the right thing by sending out scout planes and arming their attack planes with heavy bombs and torpedoes. But the commander of Taffy 3, the group most at risk of being overrun, would need prodding, Powell predicted. Taffy 3's commander, Admiral Clifton Sprague, was generally known as Ziggy. Powell referred to him as Dopey and suggested he be given an extra nudge to prepare for action in the morning. Again, Kinkaid declined. He said he did not like to give orders to another flag officer and then tell him how to carry them out. It was enough to warn the Taffys to keep an eye out to the north. Kinkaid was a by-the-book man. He was not going to follow the example of his nemesis Halsey, butting in and overriding his subordinates. As the early morning hours ticked by, the chain of command slowly clanked. At 1:15 a.m., Kinkaid ordered Sprague, the overall commander of the Taffys, to launch daybreak air searches to the north. At 3:30 a.m., Sprague ordered Taffy 2 to fly those searches, Taffy 2's Adam. Felix Stump received the order at 4:30 a.m. and ordered one of his jeep carriers, the Omni Bay, to send out search planes at dawn. The Omni Bay was slow to get going. Her crew began pushing and pulling planes around a rain-slicked deck before 6 a.m., but it would 6:58 a.m. before she would launch any planes. Too late. The Taffys were protected by a screen. 3 destroyers and 4 destroyer escorts steamed in a circle around the half-dozen jeep carriers of Taffy 3, the northernmost of the 3 groups. One of the destroyers was USS Johnston. In the early morning hours of October 25th, her captain was awake, but feeling frustrated and a little fretful. Commander Ernest Evans listened to the Battle of Surigao Strait on the radio. The tropics sometimes created freakish atmospheric conditions, allowing short-range talk between ships' conversations to be heard many miles away. The reception was unusually good that night, and Evans could hear snatches of excited chatter of warship captains ordering torpedo attacks and broadsides against the enemy. Sitting in the Johnston's Combat Information Center, a windowless room crammed with electronic gear down below the bridge, Evans seemed disappointed. If he couldn't be in the thick of the fight too, the south in Surigao Strait, the captain of the Johnston wished he was heading north with Halsey after the Japanese carriers, not babysitting Woolworth flat-tops on a calm sea miles and miles from the action. Lieutenant Ed DeGardi, the communications officer, was on the mid-watch, midnight to 4 a.m., and he sat with Evans in the Combat Information Center as they listened to the distant battle crackling through the static. DeGardi was struck that Evans did not hide his regret. Though normally taciturn, the chief had always been open about his desire for action, ever since the day of the Johnston's commissioning ceremony, when he had vowed to sail in harm's way and challenged the crew to sail with him. The Johnston had joined in 4 shore bombardments during amphibious operations in the Marshalls and Marianas, and had sunk a submarine. But Evans had never had the chance to engage an enemy ship in a sea battle. In 3 days, it would be the first anniversary of the Johnston commissioning. Evans suggested that the crew be served ice cream to celebrate. He didn't sound very enthusiastic. "Well, Hagen," he said with a sigh, "it's been an uneventful year." "Yes, sir," Hagen responded, trying to sound gruff. "I wouldn't mind seeing a little action." A few of the men of the Johnston were expressing the same disappointment over missing the battle, or at least pretending to, but more felt relief. They had heard rumors that the Japanese fleet was on the move, and news of the attacks on the Japanese in the Sibuyan Sea and the Surigao Strait quickly spread. A sailor named Harold Beresonsky recalled, "I swore up and down the deck of the Johnston that as long as we were not part of the combat force, we would see no units of the Japanese fleet. That was fine with Chief Boatswain's mate Clyde Burnett. An orphan, Burnett had learned to adjust at a very young age. Joining the Navy at 18, he had served aboard an old four-piper destroyer. He was at Pearl Harbor when the Japanese attacked. He had volunteered for submarine duty as the quickest way to get back at the Japanese. But after 3 years of war, he was in no hurry to take on the Japanese fleet. I thought we were in a pretty safe position, being 50 or 60 miles off the shore screening small carriers," he recollected many years later. "I thought surely no one will bother us here." Most of the men had never been truly scared by the Japanese. Their most intense scrape with danger had come a fortnight earlier, during an early October typhoon in the Philippine Sea. The ship had rolled 70 degrees, almost on her beam ends, and frightened sailors down below cried out in the agonizing seconds before the destroyer righted herself. DeGardi recalled the fear that gripped him as he stood on the bridge, looking up at giant waves towering over the ship. The Johnston would climb, almost straight up it seemed, vibrating and shaking, then come careening and skidding down the mountainous face of the wave. DeGardi could hear and feel the engines racing as the propellers came out of the water when the ship crested. If the Johnston lost power and the ability to turn into the waves, she would wallow helplessly and capsize. But DeGardi, like most of his fellow officers and men, had confidence in the skipper. As the storm brewed, the Johnston had been waiting to refuel. Normally, a ship keeps seawater in empty fuel tanks for ballast to keep the ship from becoming top-heavy. Ordered to jettison his ballast to prepare to take on fuel, Evans had ignored the command. His weather eye told him he would need a stable ship for the storm ahead. A little after his watch ended at 4, DeGardi went to bed. The sea was calm. He was lulled to sleep by the thrum of the ship's 2 giant steam turbine engines. Commander Evans heard the last radio transmissions from the dying battle in the Surigao Strait and turned into his sea cabin just off the bridge for a nap before general quarters, scheduled every morning at 5:30 a.m., an hour before dawn. Less than 50 miles away and closing, Admiral Kurita's fleet ploughed east, then south through the empty sea. On the bridge of the Yamato, Kurita's staff was in a state of disbelief. They had received no useful intelligence, as usual, but they had felt sure they would be greeted by American submarines as they exited the San Bernardino Strait. Chief of Staff Koyanagi had expected the fleet to fight its way out against American battleships in a night action, but the way was clear. Kurita ordered his 21 remaining ships to spread across a 13-mile-wide front in a night search disposition, but there was nothing to see. Some men began to feel their spirits lift. A kind of giddiness, fueled by relief and sleeplessness, captured at least some of the crew. But Kurita's chief operations officer, Captain Tonosuke Otani, did not share in the lightheadedness. He still expected the fleet to be completely destroyed after doing some damage inside Leyte Gulf, he would later tell interrogators. Otani was a realist, and he was not eager to commit self-killing without some good reason. He was one of the officers who had complained about sacrificing a whole fleet to shoot up some transports. Otani was not encouraged by fragmentary reports from Nishimura's fleet to the south. When Nishimura seemed to be ignoring Kurita's schedule and rushed too quickly into the Surigao Strait, Otani thought he was taking matters too lightly. Through the early morning hours, as they steamed across the blank sea, Kurita's staff officers anxiously awaited word of the battle that must be raging to the south. At 5:30, they heard the bad news from the Shigura, the one destroyer of Nishimura's fleet to escape. It appeared from the brief, fragmentary report that the fleet had been about wiped out, as Otani recalled the message. There was no word from Admiral Shima's fleet at all. Kurita's fleet was on its own. Dawn was at 6:27, but no one saw the sun rise. The morning was misty and grey with a low overcast. The wind was light, about 8 knots, and the sea was slightly choppy with a low swell. On the bridge of the Yamato, Admiral Ugaki was mourning and envying the death of Nishimura, who had been his Etajima classmate and close friend. In his diary, Ugaki recorded the weather, as he always did, commenting that dark clouds accompanied by squalls hung here and there. Admiral Kurita was about to order his ships into an anti-aircraft ring formation, preparing for the onslaught from the air he was sure would come. Over 100 miles away and steaming in the opposite direction, Admiral Halsey, with his vast force of 64 ships, was in hot pursuit of the Japanese carriers. After 3 or 4 hours of badly needed sleep, Halsey had arisen just before 1 a.m. He came into flag plot and immediately became entangled in a peculiar tug-of-war with Admiral Mitcher's chief of staff and Halsey's former protégé, Arleigh Burke. Before going to bed, Halsey had left instructions to proceed north at a deliberate pace, 16 knots. Halsey was afraid of sailing past the Japanese carriers in the night. He wanted to engage them at dawn. But while Halsey slept, Captain Burke, acting on behalf of Admiral Mitcher, had resumed tactical command of the carriers and ratcheted up the speed to 20 knots. Burke was still worried about the centre fleet coming through the San Bernardino Strait. He wanted to get up north, finish off the carriers, in the middle of the night if necessary, and be able to head back south to catch the Japanese battleships heading for Leyte Gulf. Halsey was irked by the insubordination from Mitcher's staff. Asserting his command authority, he slowed the speed back down to 16 knots and ordered a night search. Mitcher had by now arisen from his own nap and was prowling around his flag plot aboard the Lexington, dressed in a bathrobe and wearing a duck-billed cap. Mitcher warned Halsey that the night search planes might tip off the Japanese carriers and blow the element of surprise. By now, Halsey was testy. "Do you have any information we do not have?" he asked by radio. Mitcher's answer was no. "Launch the search," ordered Halsey. Shortly after 2 a.m., the search planes found the Japanese and reported them at less than 100 miles away. Halsey gave the order to prepare for battle. In the darkness, the 6 great battleships of the Third Fleet pulled out and steamed ahead in a battle line, each with more than 2,000 men at their battle stations, hoisting shells into the great guns. Mitcher ordered a first attack wave of 180 planes off the carrier decks before 5 a.m. As dawn broke, Lieutenant Solberg was standing in flag plot on the New Jersey, filled with a sense of anticipation and excitement about the battle ahead. He had banished, for the moment, the anxieties he shared with his roommate, Harris Cox, the worry that the Third Fleet was being duped by a vast Japanese deception. Solberg stepped out on a wing of the flag bridge to look upon a thrilling sight, the great battleships racing along, line abreast on a deep blue sea. The South Dakota had broken out a battle flag, an enormous stars and stripes that stood gloriously straight out, Solberg recalled. But where were the Japanese carriers? The search planes had lost them. One snooper had turned back with engine problems, another with faulty radar. Not until 7:10 that morning did a search plane find Ozawa's fleet, 1 heavy carrier, 3 light carriers, and the 2 odd-looking hermaphrodite battleships with flight decks tacked on the stern. They were not 50 or 60 miles away, but a good 180 miles away. The night search planes, it appeared, had spooked the Japanese. Ozawa's carriers had turned in the night and run north. No one aboard the New Jersey realized that this was precisely what the Japanese had planned for, a wild goose chase that would lead the American Third Fleet as far north as possible. In New Jersey's flag plot, the atmosphere of high excitement cooled and curdled as the minutes and hours with no enemy contact dragged out. The delays and mixed signals were deflating. Quickly forgotten was a puzzling message that came in at 6:48 a.m. from Kincaid of the 7th Fleet asking, "Is Task Force 34 guarding San Bernardino Strait?" This was the message, almost an afterthought, that Kincaid had sent 2.5 hours earlier at 4:12 a.m., to wind up on the pile of urgent messages stacked up to the elbows of the overworked telegraph operators at Manus. Telegraph operators could not tell which messages were more urgent than others, and this one appears to have drifted toward the bottom of the pile before being sent out on the Fox schedule distributed throughout the fleet. The message, when it finally arrived and was decoded, was perplexing, but it caused little or no concern among members of Halsey's staff, preoccupied as they were with finding the Japanese carriers. Was Task Force 34 guarding San Bernardino Strait? Why, of course not. Hadn't Halsey signalled AM proceeding north with 3 groups before midnight? As Solberg recalled, with almost a "why do you ask" air, Third Fleet shot off this unruffled reply just 7 minutes later. Negative. Task Force 34 is with carrier group now engaging enemy carrier forces. All of the attention in Flag Plot was toward the enemy to the north. No one was thinking about the enemy to the south. Admiral Koyanagi's leg was throbbing. Kurita's chief of staff had hurt himself sliding down the sloping deck of the Atago as the flagship cruiser heeled over from the American submarine's torpedoes in the Palawan Passage some 48 hours earlier. Koyanagi had struck his hip on a ringbolt in the rush to abandon ship. His thigh had turned purple, and he could walk only with a cane. He had been unable to sleep because of the pain. His commander had not even tried to rest. Admiral Kurita had not left the Yamato Bridge since he had transferred his flag on the afternoon of the 23rd, and he had not slept the night before that. He had hardly budged from his monkey seat in the corner of the bridge. He ate what the crew ate, an occasional rice ball, and drank water from a bucket. Chief of Staff Koyanagi worried about Kurita. He had developed a great affection and respect for his commander-in-chief. The two men saw each other several times every day, and for the past several days they had been inseparable. "We were like one mind, one body," Koyanagi later recalled. Their thoughts were so close that they barely needed to speak. Kurita practiced silence, Koyanagi would later say approvingly. Kurita never grew excited, never argued with his staff. He was never angry, but rather listened patiently. "He was like a father to me, and we were like a happy family," Koyanagi recalled. Kurita was not like other admirals, haughty or flashy and proud, and his men loved him for it. "Glamour types got no support from the men," recalled Koyanagi. Kurita was an old salty type, an expert ship handler, unlike the political admirals whose skills lay in currying favour with higher-ranking admirals. While quiet, Kurita was warm and human, Koyanagi recalled. The commander-in-chief of the 1st Diversionary Striking Force did not affect an air of stern remoteness. He was not like Admiral Ugaki, whose cold mask never dropped. Kurita was a regular fellow who would occasionally say something sharply humorous to cheer up his men. He loved sake and became cheerful when he drank, Koyanagi reminisced. Koyanagi knew Kurita to be a good athlete, quick and agile. He no longer played baseball with the men, but he practiced his archery every day, even at sea, for spiritual strength. In the opening minutes of the battle, Kurita's archery set had been sunk with the Atago. Now the admiral sat on the bridge of the Yamato, peering into the dim grey light of early dawn, seemingly lost in thought. Koyanagi's own thoughts were bleak. He had expected to die from enemy bombs the day before in the Sibuyan Sea. Koyanagi was a gentlemanly, elegant figure, but he had been a farmer's son, attracted to the Navy after seeing a relative, an Etajima classmate of the great Yamamoto, return home from the Battle of Tsushima when Koyanagi was an impressionable 12-year-old. "I liked the uniform," Koyanagi recalled. His war had not been as glorious as he had hoped. His great ambition had been to command a ship in battle, but when he finally did lead a destroyer flotilla in the evacuation of Guadalcanal, he was sick with dengue fever. "I commanded from bed," he recalled. Looking into the faces of the soldiers they had rescued off Starvation Island had depressed him. He surrayed the sick, drooping men as dogs that had lost their masters. For Koyanagi, victory was already Ed Hope. He had lost heart after the Battle of the Philippine Sea, when the Japanese Air Force had been savaged. He was bitter but resigned about the show plan. "It had no meaning for me," he said, "except for doing it for the honor of the Japanese Navy." In August, when he had been first told about the plan by Captain Kami, the low-level staff officer sent down from Tokyo by Combined Fleet Headquarters, Koyanagi had been indignant. When the Kurita fleet sailed out of San Bernardino Strait into an empty sea after midnight on the morning of October 25th, Koyanagi was sure the Americans were setting a trap. He believed that an American carrier task force was following them from a distance, and that another task force lay over the horizon ready to destroy the Japanese with their planes. Silence from Ozawa to the north meant that Ozawa's deception had failed, or so Koyanagi believed. At 6:23 a.m., 4 minutes before dawn, the radar operator aboard the Yamato reported blips bearing 150 degrees to the southeast. Enemy planes, thought Koyanagi. Here it comes, the final onslaught from the Americans. From the bridge, Koyanagi spotted 2 airplanes circling in the distance. But 11 minutes later, the Yamato lookouts, more than 150 feet high in the crow's nest and able to see 20 miles distant even on a misty morning, cried out, "Masts on the horizon!" Not just masts, but the shapes and silhouettes of aircraft carriers. Koyanagi was stunned to see actual ships. Planes, yes, but to think that the Americans would be careless enough to allow their carriers to come under his guns was almost too good to believe. If he were to die, he later recounted, he wanted to die crashing into an American task force of carriers. He never expected that they would be foolish enough to allow their carriers to come within range of the Yamato's 18-inch guns. Judging from the dim shapes forming on the distant horizon, the Americans had somehow made a critical mistake. Koyanagi had been at Kurita's side at Brunei when the commander-in-chief gave his speech urging his captains to believe in divine intervention. Koyanagi had not been particularly moved. He had thought Kurita was going through the motions. But now he wondered if perhaps he had been too jaded. Maybe there were such things as miracles.